Somewhere around 1,000,000 years ago, something strange started happening to your ancestors. They began losing their fur, not gradually shedding a little here and there like a dog in summer, losing almost the entire coat, everywhere except a handful of very specific, very stubborn patches. If you stop and think about it, that's bizarre. Nearly every mammal on this planet solved the how do I survive the world problem by wrapping itself in fur. Fur regulates temperature, blocks UV rays, protects skin, and even signals information to other animals through color and texture. It's a proven survival tool, refined over tens of millions of years. And yet here we are, bald. Practically bare-skinned primates wandering around a planet where every one of our closest relatives, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, bonobos, kept their thick coat of hair. We are, by primate standards, the weird ones. Today, we're going to dig into two mysteries stacked on top of each other. First, why did humans lose their fur at all, when every survival instinct in evolutionary biology says fur is useful? And second, the stranger one, the one that still doesn't have a fully agreed upon answer among scientists. Why did we keep hair in a few very specific places, especially the one region that seems to embarrass documentary narrators the most, the groin? Let's start with the bigger mystery. Part 1, the naked ape problem. For most of the 20th century, scientists didn't have a great explanation for human hairlessness. Some early theories were a little shaky. The so-called aquatic ape hypothesis, the idea that we lost our fur during a phase of semi-aquatic living. It's a fun idea. It still shows up in documentaries, but it's never gathered serious mainstream support. There's just not enough evidence behind it. The explanation that has actually held up under scrutiny, the one backed by researchers like Peter Wheeler and Nina Jablonski, comes down to something much more physical, much more brutal: running. Here's the setup. Somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago, our ancestors were transitioning into a lifestyle built around endurance, not sprinting. Chimpanzees and gorillas can outsprint a human easily over short distances. But over long distances, in open, sun-scorched grassland, humans have an almost unfair advantage. We can keep going, hour after hour, in blistering heat, long after four-legged animals are forced to stop and pant in the shade. This is sometimes called persistence hunting, and there's still ethnographic evidence of hunter-gatherer groups using it today, chasing an antelope not to outrun it, but to overheat it, until it collapses, and the hunters simply walk up to it. To pull that off, your body needs one thing more than anything else: an extremely efficient cooling system. And this is where fur becomes a liability instead of an asset. Fur is phenomenal insulation. It's built to trap heat. What it is spectacularly bad at is releasing heat quickly. If you're a running, sweating primate trying to dump enormous amounts of heat generated by muscles working overtime under direct equatorial sun, a thick coat is actively working against you. So the trade evolution appears to have made is this: give up the insulating coat and replace it with something far more effective for heat dissipation. Bare skin, packed with an extraordinary number of eccrine sweat glands, capable of evaporative cooling on a level that no other primate and almost no other mammal can match. To put this in perspective, a chimpanzee's sweating capacity isn't even in the same category as a human's. We are, without exaggeration, one of the best cooling machines in the animal kingdom, built by natural selection specifically for endurance and heat. Now here's the part that surprises most people when they first hear it. You are not actually less hairy than a chimpanzee. Follicle for follicle, humans and chimpanzees have roughly the same density of hair follicles across their skin. The number didn't change. What changed is what those follicles decided to do with their lives. Hair follicles produce different categories of hair. There's terminal hair, thick, long, pigmented, the kind you see on a chimp's arm or on your own scalp, eyebrows, and eyelashes. And there's vellus hair, the fine, short, barely pigmented peach fuzz that covers most of your body right now, so light you probably forget it's even there. At some point in our evolutionary past, the genetic switches controlling most of your body's follicles flipped from grow thick terminal hair to grow practically invisible vellus hair. You didn't lose your hair count. Your body just turned almost everything down to a whisper, keeping only a few regions on the old, thick setting. Which raises an obvious question. When did this actually happen? Part 2, dating the nakedness with lice. This is one of my favorite pieces of scientific detective work in all of evolutionary biology, because the tool used to figure it out is, of all things, lice. In 2003, a research team, Kittler, Kaiser, and Stoneking, had a clever idea. Humans host two closely related but genetically distinct types of lice: head lice, which live in scalp hair, and body lice, which live specifically in clothing fibers. Body lice could not have evolved as a distinct species until humans were regularly wearing clothing, because clothing is their entire habitat. No clothes, no niche for body lice to specialize into. So by comparing the genetic divergence between head lice and body lice DNA and using known mutation rates as a molecular clock, the researchers could estimate roughly when body lice split off as their own lineage, which tells you, indirectly, roughly when humans started wearing clothes. Their estimate, somewhere around 72,000 years ago, give or take a wide margin of error. A later, more sophisticated analysis in 2011 by Toops and colleagues, using a more refined data set, pushed that estimate significantly further back, closer to 170,000 years ago, though again with a fairly wide range of uncertainty. Either way, here's the punchline that actually matters: the direction of causation. Humans didn't start wearing clothes and then gradually lose their fur because they no longer needed it. It's the opposite. Humans needed clothing because they were already nearly hairless. The nakedness came first, sometimes by an enormous margin. Clothing was damage control, a cultural, technological patch applied to a biological trait that had already been in place for a very long time. Which tells us when clothing-driven hairlessness was already an established fact of human life. But it doesn't tell us when the fur itself actually started disappearing in the first place. For that, scientists had to go looking at a completely different piece of DNA. Part 3, the pigmentation clue. Enter MC1R, the gene responsible for controlling melanin production and skin pigmentation. Researchers Alan Rogers, David Iltis, and Stephen Wooding reasoned through this problem from a different angle entirely. Once your ancestors lost the fur that had been shielding their skin from direct equatorial sunlight for millions of years, that newly exposed skin would have been suddenly, urgently vulnerable to ultraviolet radiation damage. Sunburn, skin cancer, folate depletion, all serious threats to survival and reproduction. Natural selection doesn't tolerate that kind of vulnerability for long. So the logic goes, whenever fur loss actually happened, strong selective pressure to darken skin pigmentation as protection should have followed almost immediately afterward. By analyzing the genetic variation and mutation patterns around the MC1R gene, their 2004 analysis estimated that this pigmentation pressure kicked in roughly 1.2 million years ago. Stop and sit with that number for a second. That means the naked ape phase of human evolution likely began with Homo erectus, over 1 million years before anatomically modern Homo sapiens, the version of humans you'd actually recognize walking down the street, even existed. So to summarize the timeline as we currently understand it, a hairless, heat-dissipating body evolved somewhere around 1.2 million years ago, driven by the demands of endurance running and thermoregulation on the African savanna. Clothing, as a cultural workaround for that hairlessness, didn't show up until somewhere between 70,000 and 170,000 years ago, meaning our ancestors likely walked around essentially naked, bare-skinned, and fur-free for over 1 million years before anyone thought to wrap themselves in animal hide. Part 4, we're not the only naked mammal, but we're the strangest one. Humans aren't unique in losing body hair. Elephants are famously near hairless for a similar thermoregulatory reason. Their enormous body mass makes overheating dangerous, so bare skin and giant, radiator-like ears help dump heat. Whales and dolphins lost their fur for a different reason entirely: hydrodynamics, with blubber replacing fur for insulation underwater. Naked mole rats lost theirs, living underground in thermally stable burrows, where insulation just isn't needed. What makes humans unusual isn't hairlessness itself. It's that we're a mid-sized, land-dwelling primate that went hairless. Among primates specifically, we're the dramatic outlier. Every other ape kept the coat, and that gamble is precisely why the leftover patches of hair are so scientifically interesting. If hairlessness was such a strong, non-negotiable survival advantage that it swept across nearly the entire body, why did evolution allow exceptions? Part 5, the scalp, the easy one. Let's deal with the simplest leftover first: the hair on top of your head. This one barely generates scientific debate because the explanation is straightforward and well supported. Your scalp sits directly above your brain, the single most metabolically expensive, heat-sensitive organ in your entire body. Overheating the brain, even by a small margin, has serious cognitive and physiological consequences. A layer of scalp hair does double duty. It shades the skull from direct, overhead solar radiation, the most intense angle of sun exposure near the equator, while still letting airflow and sweat evaporation happen freely across the rest of the head and face. Essentially, a built-in sun hat evolution never bothered to take off. Nobody seriously disputes this explanation. It's clean, it's logical, and it fits neatly into the same heat management story as everything else we've covered so far. Now let's get to the genuinely murky one. Part 6, pubic hair. Evolutionary biology's unsolved case file. This is where things get interesting, because unlike the scalp, there is no single, settled, textbook answer for why humans retain dense hair specifically in the groin and underarm regions. Multiple competing hypotheses exist side by side, none of them conclusively proven, and researchers who study this openly admit the uncertainty. Let's walk through the leading theories one at a time. Theory 1, friction reduction. The most mechanically simple explanation is that hair in this region reduces skin-on-skin friction during movement, walking, and particularly intercourse, acting as a kind of natural cushioning or lubricant retention layer that reduces chafing and irritation. It's a perfectly reasonable, intuitive idea. The problem is that nobody has actually run rigorous, controlled experiments confirming this mechanically. It remains a plausible hypothesis resting more on common sense than on hard data. Theory 2, pheromone signaling. The popular but shaky story. This is probably the explanation most people have already heard, usually secondhand, often stated with far more confidence than the science actually supports. Here's what's definitely true. The pubic and underarm regions are unusually dense with apocrine glands, a type of sweat gland fundamentally different from the eccrine glands responsible for our evaporative cooling system. Apocrine glands stay biologically dormant throughout childhood and switch on specifically at puberty, at which point they begin producing a thick, protein, and lipid-rich secretion. That secretion itself is essentially odorless. It only becomes what we recognize as body odor once skin bacteria break those compounds down. The popular narrative built on top of this biological fact claims that pubic and underarm hair evolved specifically to trap and amplify that scent, broadcasting it outward as a chemical signal to potential mates, a human pheromone system. Here's the twist that surprises most people. Despite decades of dedicated research effort, there is still no solid, replicated scientific evidence that humans actually respond behaviorally to specific pheromone molecules the way insects or many other mammals do. Researchers have repeatedly tried to isolate a genuine human sex pheromone. Results have either failed to replicate or come up empty entirely. So to be precise about where the science actually stands, the glands are real. The odor-producing chemistry is real and well documented. The claim that hair specifically evolved to weaponize that odor as a mating signal is popular, widely repeated in casual science content, and still fundamentally unproven. Theory 3, a visual signal instead of a chemical one. A different school of thought argues the function isn't chemical at all. It's visual. Pubic hair, under this theory, functions as a sharp, unmistakable marker of sexual maturity, appearing suddenly and predictably at puberty like a biological status changed, notice visible instantly at a glance rather than requiring close contact to detect. Some researchers find this framing especially compelling for a subtle reason involving comparison across species. In every other primate, the entire body remains covered in fur, meaning the genital region never stood out visually from the surrounding coat. There was no contrast to notice. Humans, having gone essentially bare almost everywhere else on the body, may have inadvertently transformed this one remaining patch into something that reads as a strong, unmistakable visual signal. Not necessarily because it was selected to be a signal originally, but because the disappearance of hair everywhere else around it made it one by default. The honest, unsatisfying, scientifically correct answer. When pressed directly, researchers in this field will tell you plainly, nobody has definitively settled which of these explanations, friction reduction, chemical signaling, visual signaling, is correct, or whether any single one of them fully accounts for the trait on its own. And that's actually a normal, unremarkable situation in evolutionary biology, even if it feels unsatisfying as a viewer. Evolution doesn't require a trait to serve one single, tidy purpose to be maintained. A feature can persist because it provides several small, overlapping, mildly useful benefits simultaneously. Some friction reduction here, some odor retention there, some visual signaling as a side effect, with no single one of those benefits being individually decisive enough on its own to fully explain the trait. Biology is rarely as clean as a single cause explanation. Part 7. Culture enters the picture. It's worth noting that the biological story and the cultural story of body hair have run on separate tracks for most of human history, and they often get tangled together in popular conversation. Archaeological evidence shows deliberate body hair removal is ancient. Shaving tools and depilatory practices show up across independent civilizations, from ancient Egypt to the Roman world, often tied to hygiene or social status rather than anything biological. Humans have been culturally negotiating with this evolutionary leftover for thousands of years, layering fashion and social meaning on top of a trait biology installed for entirely different reasons. What counts as normal grooming has shifted across eras and cultures, itself a hint that the trait's original biological function isn't tied to how any one society treats it today. Part 8. Busting a modern myth. Before we wrap up, there's a specific, fairly recent myth worth correcting because it spread widely and hasn't been fully walked back in most people's minds. For several years, headlines circulated claiming that shaving or waxing pubic hair measurably increased a person's risk of contracting sexually transmitted infections. This claim traced back to a widely reported 2017 survey study, and it sounded alarming enough that it spread quickly through mainstream media. The problem is that a follow-up study in 2019, specifically designed to test for a direct link with chlamydia and gonorrhea infection rates, found no statistically significant connection at all between grooming habits and STI transmission. What the original 2017 data more likely captured was correlation without causation. People who groom more aggressively may simply, on average, differ from those who don't in other unrelated risk behaviors. And that underlying difference, not the grooming itself, was likely driving the original statistical association. Science, quietly and without much fanfare, corrected itself a couple of years later, mostly without the headlines that accompanied the original alarming claim. What we can say with genuine, well-documented confidence is narrower and less dramatic. Aggressive or frequent grooming does carry a measurable, well-documented increase in minor injuries, cuts, burns, ingrown hairs, and general skin irritation. That part holds up. The STI connection does not. Beyond that, pubic hair today functions less like an essential biological necessity you'd suffer without, and more like a genuine evolutionary leftover. A set of plausible, partial, overlapping benefits inherited from ancestors who needed it for reasons science still hasn't fully, conclusively reconstructed. Closing. So here's where roughly 1 million years of hair loss actually lands us. Your ancestors traded a full-body insulating coat for an elite, marathon-grade evaporative cooling system, built for chasing prey across open, sun-baked terrain that no other primate could survive running across for hours at a time. They kept just enough hair on the scalp to shield the single organ that made all of that endurance-based strategy, tool use, and eventual civilization possible in the first place. And they left behind a handful of smaller, stubborn patches, underarms, groin, whose exact original purpose remains genuinely, scientifically unresolved, more than a century after Darwin first started asking these kinds of questions. Sitting on your body right now is a small, unsolved mystery from deep prehistory, one that clothing itself was invented tens of thousands of years later, specifically to hide.